My name is James Carter, and if you're reading this, never go to a remote mountain cabin alone in the winter. Because I did. And even though I made it back, I can never forget what I saw there. It was only a week into 2025. A new year might mean a fresh start for some people, but for me, it was just the beginning of a collapse. I had lost my job, my fiancé had left me, and I had lost my mother. Everything had hit me all at once. I felt trapped, suffocated. I couldn't stay in the city. If I did, I'd drown. I needed to get away from everything. My best friend, David, told me his family owned an old hunting cabin. It was deep in the Wyoming mountains, completely isolated. No neighbors, no roads, no town nearby, exactly what I needed. But there was a problem. He couldn't find the key. "Don't worry," he said. "The lock is broken. If you push the door, it'll open." At the time, I thought that detail didn't matter. After all, I was just going there to clear my head. How I got inside didn't seem important. I packed enough canned food for a few days, a rifle, some books, and a bottle of whiskey. Since my phone wouldn't have service, David gave me an old radio. "Only turn it on in an emergency," he said. And so I left. When I arrived, everything was just as he had described, completely desolate. The cabin stood alone among the trees, buried under thick layers of snow, like a forgotten shadow. There wasn't a single footprint around. The air was freezing, so cold that my breath lingered in the air like a frozen mist. I pushed the door. It creaked open easily. The moment I stepped inside, I could tell the place hadn't been used in a long time. The air was damp and stale. It was nearly as cold inside as it was outside. The fireplace contained burned wood remnants, but it was impossible to tell how long they had been there. I unpacked my things and lit a fire. Slowly, the room started to warm up. As I looked around, I noticed old black and white hunting photos nailed to the wooden walls. The faces of the men in the pictures were blurry, but their expressions were serious and lifeless. Outside, the snowstorm hadn't started yet, but the sky was dark and heavy. The clouds stretched out like an empty gray void. It felt unsettling. But I made it through the first night without any problems. I read a book, ate some canned food, and had a few sips of whiskey. Maybe this really was what I needed. Until midnight, I was asleep. Then I heard a noise at the door. My eyes snapped open. A deep chill ran through me. It sounded like something was tapping against the cabin door. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But a few seconds later, I heard it again. A slow, irregular rhythm. I grabbed my rifle and moved toward the door. My hands trembled slightly. I took a deep breath and suddenly pulled it open. No one was there, but there were footprints in the snow. And the worst part, the prints led up to the cabin. But there were no prints leading away. The weather got worse. A snowstorm had buried everything. I was completely trapped inside. And then, at midnight, the noise returned. This time, it came from the window. I turned my head slowly. On the fogged-up glass, a number had been drawn. 5. My breath hitched. I stepped closer to the window, hoping it was just a prank. But 10 minutes later, when I looked again, the number had changed. 4. As if someone was counting down. A static-filled voice came through the radio. "Can you hear me?" It wasn't David's voice. I grabbed the radio, but it was turned off. How was I hearing a voice from a radio that wasn't even on? Was I really alone here? I started searching the cabin, and then I noticed a loose wooden panel behind the fireplace. I pressed on it, and it shifted slightly inward. Behind it, I found an old note. The first thing I noticed was the date. It was written 10 years ago. There was only one sentence. "If you're reading this, you're next." I couldn't breathe. I had to leave. Now. But just as I turned toward the door, Snow was piling in under the crack, and a single footprint had appeared. Inside, right next to my bed. I didn't think, I just ran. Through the blizzard, stumbling, struggling to find my way, my legs burned, my lungs felt frozen. But I had no other choice. My radio finally worked. I reached David and described where I was heading. Hours later, I reached the main road, and I saw David's car. I jumped in, breathless, and told him everything. David's face went pale. He told me that no one had used the cabin in years, but that last winter someone had died there, and their body was never found. Still, I don't think he truly believed me, and I realized just how little he believed me when I noticed something. Instead of driving toward the city, he had turned the car toward the cabin. I didn't realize where we were heading until we were already there. I refused to get out of the car, but David stepped out and walked toward the cabin. He wasn't gone for long. Soon, he came running back. He jumped into the driver's seat, started the car, and floored the gas pedal. I asked him what happened. He didn't answer. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. I looked back at the cabin one last time through the car's side mirror, and my blood ran cold, because on the cabin window, written from the inside, was a new number. 1. My name is Jake Thompson, and after what I experienced, I swear I will never ask a stranger for help in the middle of the night. Because I did, and it almost cost me my life. I will remember this date for the rest of my life. Thursday, February 13th, 2025. I was driving down one of the most isolated roads in Wyoming. For miles, there wasn't a single streetlight, gas station, or even a sign. The road stretched into endless darkness, its icy surface shimmering faintly under the moonlight. It had just passed midnight. The temperature was minus 15 degrees. My phone battery was nearly dead, and there was no signal anyway. The only thing still working in my car were the headlights, barely piercing through the dark. Sleep was creeping in. My eyelids were heavy, but I wanted to reach a town as soon as possible and find a motel. The winter storm had kept the roads closed for days, and this stretch of asphalt ahead of me felt like a gateway into the unknown. That road alone was enough to unsettle anyone. I had a growing sense of unease, but I blamed it on exhaustion. I was wrong. For a split second, I saw movement in the beam of my headlights. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself I was just seeing things. It had to be fatigue playing tricks on me. But then, the road beneath my car suddenly turned to ice. The tires lost traction. The steering wheel spun uselessly in my hands. Within seconds, my car went completely out of control. I slammed the brakes, but it was no use. The car skidded across the icy road like a weightless sled before slamming into the steel guardrail. My head hit the steering wheel. For a moment, everything went black. The engine died. A deadly silence settled around me. Even the wind had stopped. I pushed the door open and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a brick, forcing its way into my lungs. It was so frigid that it felt like my breath was freezing inside me. I looked around. The road was empty. Snow was falling slowly, but there were no tracks on the ground. No signs of another vehicle, no signs of life. No one had passed through here in a long time. I stood there, motionless. Then, in the distance, I saw a pair of headlights. They were getting closer. At first, I thought I was lucky, but that uneasy feeling inside me grew stronger. The vehicle slowed down. It was an old, dusty, and battered pickup truck. The window rolled down. Inside, an older man with a rough face sat behind the wheel. He was wearing a worn-out, ripped flannel shirt. His beard was unkempt, but the most unsettling thing was his eyes. Bloodshot and empty. There was no trace of emotion. Stranded? He asked. His voice had a strange tone, neither warm nor cold, neither friendly nor hostile. Yeah, I said, my voice trembling. The man tilted his head slightly, squinting at me. He didn't speak for several seconds. Then he unlocked the door. Get in, I'll take you to a town, he said. I climbed inside. The truck was warm, but the atmosphere was unbearable. The radio crackled with static, but the man didn't change the station. He just listened in silence. And then I noticed something. There were 2 more people in the back seat, but it took me a moment to realize because both of them had their heads down. Then, at the exact same time, they lifted them. And they stared at me without blinking. My breath caught in my throat. Every hair on my body stood on end. My entire body tensed. The fact that they were behind me only made it worse. Where are we going? I asked. The driver, still looking at the road, smiled. But it wasn't a human smile. You'll see soon enough, he said. And then he turned off the main road. The unease inside me turned into pure, uncontrollable panic. This isn't the way to town, I said. One of the men in the back let out a chuckle. A cold, empty, humorless laugh. We know a shortcut, he said. He never took his eyes off me. I glanced at the door handle. Could I jump out and run? The truck was going 80 kilometers per hour. If I jumped, I'd get hurt. But if I stayed, I didn't know what would happen. And then, one of the men in the back reached into his pocket. A metallic sound. A knife. The truck slowed slightly as it took a turn. And in that moment, I threw the door open and flung myself outside with all my strength. The freezing wind hit me like a blade. I rolled across the icy ground, sharp chunks of ice tearing at my skin, but I didn't care. I scrambled to my feet and ran. Shouts erupted behind me. They were chasing me. I ran into the woods, running as if my life depended on it, because it did. I kept running until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out. Behind me, the voices multiplied, like a choir. A massive, inhuman chorus. There were more of them than just the 3 in the truck. Hours later, I reached the highway. A police patrol spotted me. I was exhausted, freezing, and barely able to stand. I told them everything. The truck, the driver, those eerie passengers, but they never found the truck. It had vanished. The police searched the roads, but there wasn't a single track in the snow. No tire marks, no footprints, nothing. It was as if that truck had never existed. And what the police told me was even more disturbing. In the past 2 years, at least 6 people had gone missing in that area. But no one had ever reported seeing a truck. No one except me. The police investigated the missing persons cases. Some of the victims' bodies had been found, and they all had one thing in common: strange, circular cuts on their bodies, like ritual markings. And then the police showed me a photo, one of the men I had seen in the truck. The picture was from an old newspaper, dated back to the 1980s. The man was the leader of a cult that had disappeared in that region. A cult that believed in summoning supernatural beings through human sacrifices. And the most terrifying part? The place where they performed their rituals was very close to the spot where I had crashed. That night, I didn't just get into a truck. I got into a nightmare, and that nightmare isn't over. Because sometimes, when I'm driving down empty roads at night, I see those headlights again. And I know they're still looking for me. My name is Liam. Every year, I visit my family's old winter home in a remote mountain town in Colorado. This place, where I spent my childhood, had become worn down, cold, and rotting from the damp. My father tried to repair it every year, but the house's eerie, unsettling atmosphere never changed. It was late January. A brutal snowstorm had hit, covering everything in a thick white blanket. My younger brother Finn and I decided to play in the snow behind the house. There was a forested area back there. As kids, we used to scare each other into believing there were creatures lurking in the woods. Finn wanted to build a snow fort on the neighboring property. This was a summer home area, but in the winter it was completely deserted. We used to play there as kids, but that day the cold was unbearable, and the snowfall had reduced visibility to almost nothing. Finn planned to hide in the fort while I searched for him. He was supposed to blow his whistle as a signal. Minutes passed, but no whistle came. The snowstorm had intensified, turning everything into a white blur. "Finn!" I called out, but the wind carried my voice away. I was starting to worry. I walked over to the neighboring property, following the footprints in the snow. The tracks led to the fort. I searched around it. "Finn!" I called again, my voice shaking from the cold. Just then, I heard a noise from the neighbor's house. "Do you need help, little one?" An old woman stood at the doorway. Her face was lined with deep wrinkles, her eyes pale and expressionless. "My brother is missing," I said, breathless. "Have you seen him?" The woman tilted her head slightly, squinting at me for a long moment. "There's no one here," she said. Then she smiled. Her teeth yellowed, her lips dry and cracked. "Come inside, you must be freezing." Everything about her unsettled me. Her smile. It felt wrong. Like she was hiding something. I looked at the house. On the upper floor, in one of the windows, a shadow appeared. A figure, its face half covered by a black beanie, the other half swallowed by the darkness of the room. For a moment I thought it was Finn, but the figure didn't move. With all my strength, I yelled, "Finn!" The woman's expression instantly changed. Her smile disappeared, and she frowned. From inside, I heard the sound of footsteps, someone coming down the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned and ran. When I glanced back, the shadow in the window was gone. The woman still stood in the doorway, watching me, holding something in her hands, but in the dim light I couldn't tell what it was. Just then, I heard my father's whistle, the familiar sound he used to call us home. When I reached the house, Finn and my father were at the door. Finn's face was pale. "That woman tried to get me inside," he said, his voice shaking. "But when she opened the door, someone grabbed my arm. I ran." My father immediately grabbed a crowbar and went to the neighbor's house. The door was locked. No one answered. Finn and I stayed inside while our mother tried to calm us down. When my father returned, his face was pale. "The house is empty," he said, "but there are footprints, lots of them." We called the neighbors. The owners of the house weren't supposed to be there that weekend. The police arrived and searched the place. They found nothing. But there was something my father didn't tell us that night. At the back door, he had found a sack. Inside, there was an old rope and a rusty knife. The next morning, Finn and I went outside. The snow had stopped. We walked over to the neighbor's house to look at the tracks. Finn's footprints led to the fort, but next to them were another set, large, deep boot prints, and something else, a thin line in the snow, trailing from the fort to the house, like something had been dragged. The trail ended at the door. After that day, we never went near that house again. But one night, when I couldn't sleep, I looked out my window. A figure stood in the snow in front of the neighbor's house, tall, thin, unmoving, holding something in its hand, a sack. My heart nearly stopped. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, we found something outside the house. Finn's whistle, lying in the snow, stained with blood. The police found nothing. But those footprints, that sack, that knife. I know that if Finn had stepped inside that house, he would never have come back. And I still wonder, was that woman and that shadow waiting for me too?